I was driving cross-country, moving to a new city for a fresh start. My car was packed to the brim with everything I owned, and the highway stretched endlessly ahead of me. The drive was long, but I didn't mind. The solitude was soothing, until I found myself running low on gas. It was nearing dusk when I spotted a faded sign for Ashton Gas, and Food 5 miles the arrow pointed down a narrow road that disappeared into a dense forest. It wasn't on my map, but I didn't have much choice. The gas gauge was teetering on empty. The road twisted and turned, the trees looming over me like a tunnel. By the time I reached the town, the sun had dipped below the horizon, casting everything in deep shadow. Ashton looked like it had been pulled straight out of the 1950s. The streets were cobblestone, the storefronts small and quaint. A diner with a neon open sign sat at the corner, its light flickering faintly. I spotted the gas station just ahead, a single pump in front of a small garage. I pulled in, but no one came out to greet me. The pump was ancient, with a hand crank mechanism I'd only seen in old movies. A bell above the garage door jingled, and a man stepped out. He wore a mechanic's jumpsuit, his hands greasy, and his face hidden under the brim of a baseball cap. "Need a fill-up?" he asked, his voice rough but polite. "Yeah, thanks," I said, pulling out my wallet. He didn't ask for payment, just nodded and started cranking the pump. As he worked, I glanced around the town. It was eerily quiet. There were no cars, no pedestrians, just rows of darkened windows staring back at me. I asked, "Is it always this quiet?" The man paused, wiping his hands on a rag. "It's a small town," he said. "People turn in early." He finished pumping the gas and pointed toward the diner. "Food's decent there if you're hungry." I nodded, thanking him as I climbed back into my car. The gas station felt too empty, too still. The diner wasn't much better. Inside, the air smelled of stale coffee and fried food. A jukebox in the corner played an old jazz tune, its notes scratchy and faint. A single waitress stood behind the counter, her uniform crisp and her smile too wide. "Welcome," she said, her voice cheery. "Sit anywhere you like." I chose a booth by the window, my back to the wall. The diner was empty except for a man sitting at the counter, hunched over a cup of coffee. He didn't look up as I passed. The waitress handed me a menu, but I barely glanced at it. Something about the place felt off. The air too thick, the silence too heavy. When she came back, I ordered a burger and coffee, trying to act normal. As I waited, I pulled out my phone to check the time, but the screen wouldn't turn on. I frowned, tapping the buttons, but it was completely dead. "Great," I muttered. The waitress returned with my coffee, setting it down with a clatter. "Long drive?" she asked, her tone conversational. "Yeah," I said, "just passing through." Her smile faltered for a moment, her eyes flicking toward the man at the counter. He still hadn't moved, his coffee untouched. "You're lucky you stopped here," she said. "Not much else around." I didn't know how to respond, so I just nodded, taking a sip of the coffee. It was bitter, almost metallic, but I forced it down. The man at the counter stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. Without a word, he walked out, the bell above the door jingling faintly. The waitress watched him go, her smile returning. "Don't mind him," she said. "He's been here a long time." I didn't ask what she meant. When my food came, I ate quickly, eager to get back on the road. The burger tasted off, the meat too chewy, but I was starving. I paid in cash, leaving a generous tip, and thanked the waitress. "Drive safe," she said as I left. Her smile never wavered. Back in the car, I started the engine and pulled onto the main road. The GPS was still frozen, but I figured I could retrace my steps. The trees closed in around me again, the road narrowing as I drove. After a few minutes, I realized something was wrong. The road wasn't curving the way it had before. It felt longer, the turns unfamiliar. I kept driving, telling myself I'd find the highway soon. Instead, I ended up back in Ashton. I slammed on the brakes, my heart pounding. The diner's neon sign flickered in the distance, the gas station dark and empty. It was like I'd never left. I turned the car around, taking another route out of town. But no matter which way I went, the road always looped back to Ashton. The cobblestone streets, the darkened windows, the flickering neon, they were waiting for me every time. Panic set in as I pulled into the gas station. The pump was still there, but the mechanic was gone. I shouted hello, hoping for a response, but the town remained silent. The diner's door creaked open, the bell jingling softly. I turned, my breath catching in my throat. The waitress stood in the doorway, her smile eerily calm. "You shouldn't have come back," she said. I stammered. I didn't mean to. "I just want to leave." She tilted her head, her smile faltering for the first time. "You can't," she said. "Not until it's done." "Until what's done?" I demanded, but she didn't answer. She stepped back into the diner, the door swinging shut behind her. The lights in the town began to flicker one by one. The air grew colder, the shadows deeper. I climbed back into my car, gripping the wheel tightly as I floored the gas. The road stretched endlessly ahead, the trees blurring together. No matter how fast I drove, Ashton loomed in the distance, its clock tower frozen at 11:55. I haven't left. I've driven every road, taken every path, but they all lead back to Ashton. The streets are empty now, the buildings crumbling. The waitress is gone, the mechanic too. Even the diner has gone dark, but the clock tower still stands, its hands unmoving. And every night I hear the faint chime of a bell, calling me back to the diner. I know I'll have to go eventually. Because whatever it is, it's not done with me yet. There was something. I was heading to a friend's wedding in a small mountain town when I got lost. The GPS on my phone had gone haywire, rerouting me in circles, and the last road sign I'd passed had been rusted and illegible. It was nearing dusk when I spotted the turnoff for Bellwood. The sign read Bellwood Pop. 912. Though the numbers had been scratched out and rewritten, as if someone couldn't decide how many people actually lived there. The town wasn't on my map, but I figured I could stop and ask for directions. My gas tank was low, and the idea of driving through the mountains in the dark wasn't appealing. The main road into Bellwood was lined with tall, overgrown hedges that blocked my view of anything beyond them. When I finally reached the center of town, it was like stepping into another century. The buildings were old but well maintained. Quaint little shops with painted signs, a cobblestone square with a fountain, and a church steeple that loomed against the darkening sky. There were no cars, no people, no sounds other than the faint rustle of leaves in the wind. The place felt abandoned, though the lights in the windows suggested otherwise. I parked near the fountain and stepped out, the air cool against my skin. "Hello?" I called, my voice echoing off the buildings. No response. I walked toward a small general store with a wooden sign that creaked in the breeze. The door was unlocked, the bell above it jingling as I stepped inside. Shelves lined with canned goods and dusty jars filled the space, and an old cash register sat on the counter. Behind it stood a man. He looked up as I entered, his face pale and gaunt, his eyes shadowed. "Evening," he said, his voice low and gravelly. "Lost?" "Yeah," I admitted, trying to keep my tone light. "I'm looking for the main highway. My GPS isn't working." He nodded slowly, his gaze drifting toward the window. "Not much works out here." He gestured toward a map pinned to the wall. "Roads are tricky in these parts. I can point you the way." I thanked him, relief washing over me as I walked to the map. It was old and faded, the paper yellowed with age, but it showed the surrounding area. The man traced a path with his finger, his nail dragging slightly as he said, "Take this road out of town, don't stop, and don't turn around." The way he said it sent a chill down my spine. "Why would I turn around?" I asked, forcing a laugh. He didn't answer. Instead, he leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. The town doesn't like it when people linger. I stared at him, my unease growing. Before I could ask what he meant, the bell above the door jingled. I turned to see a woman enter, her dress tattered and her face obscured by a wide-brimmed hat. She didn't look at me, her movements slow and deliberate as she walked to the back of the store. I need to go, I said, backing toward the door. The man nodded, his expression unreadable. Drive fast, he said. Don't stop for anything. I practically ran to my car, my heart pounding as I climbed inside and started the engine. The streets were still empty as I sped through town, the headlights casting long shadows across the cobblestones. The road out of Bellwood was narrow and winding, the trees on either side forming a canopy overhead. The deeper I drove, the darker it seemed to get, the headlights barely illuminating the way. Then I saw them. Figures standing at the edge of the road, their forms blurred and indistinct. At first I thought they were shadows cast by the trees, but as I got closer I realized they were moving. Slowly, deliberately, stepping into the road. I slammed on the brakes, the car skidding to a stop. The figures didn't react. They stood in a loose semicircle, blocking the way forward. Their faces were pale, their eyes dark and empty. I honked the horn, but they didn't move. My hands shook as I shifted into reverse, the car lurching backward. The road behind me was clear, but when I turned to look forward again, the figures were gone. I pressed the gas, speeding down the road, my breath coming in shallow gasps. The radio crackled to life, a burst of static filling the car before fading into a faint, whispering voice. Come back, it said. I shook my head, gripping the wheel tightly. No way. The road twisted and turned, the trees closing in around me. I kept driving, my foot heavy on the gas, but the town's presence lingered. The air felt thick, oppressive, as if something unseen was pressing down on me. Just as I thought I was free, the car shuddered, the engine sputtering before stalling. The headlights flickered and died, plunging me into darkness. No, no, I muttered, turning the key in the ignition. The engine whined but didn't catch. My phone was useless, the screen frozen on the GPS app. I sat there, the silence pressing in, until I heard it. Footsteps. They were faint at first, like someone walking through the woods. Then they grew louder, closer, until they were right outside the car. I locked the doors, my hands shaking as I peered out the window. The figures were back, their faces inches from the glass. Their eyes were hollow, their expressions blank. One of them raised a hand, pressing it against the window. It left no smudge, no mark, as if it weren't entirely solid. Come back, the voice whispered again, this time louder. Stay. I squeezed my eyes shut, refusing to look, refusing to listen. I turned the key again, praying the engine would start. It roared to life. I didn't wait. I slammed the car into gear, the tires spinning as I tore down the road. The figures vanished in the rearview mirror, replaced by the trees blurring past. When I finally reached the highway, I didn't stop. I drove for hours. The image of those hollow eyes burned into my mind. The next day, I tried to find Bellwood on a map, but it wasn't there. I asked the locals about it, but no one had ever heard of the town. It was as if it had never existed. But I know what I saw, and sometimes late at night I hear that voice again, faint and distant. Come back. There was I hadn't planned to stop in Elmswood. In fact, I hadn't even known it existed. It was supposed to be a straight shot to the cabin I'd rented for a weekend getaway. The GPS had other ideas. A wrong turn, a stretch of road I didn't recognize, and before I knew it, the sun was setting behind a wall of dense trees. The signal on my phone dropped to 0, leaving me stranded on an unfamiliar highway. I thought about turning back, but I was already low on gas. Then I saw the sign. Welcome to Elmswood, a town frozen in time. The sign was old, its paint chipped and weathered, but the words were clear. Just beyond it, A narrow road led into the trees. Desperate fuel and directions, I followed it. Elmswood wasn't like any town I'd ever seen. The buildings were old, Victorian-style homes with peeling paint, their windows dark. The streets were empty, the air heavy with the smell of damp earth. A single gas station stood at the edge of town, its pumps rusted and its sign flickering faintly. I pulled in, relieved to see a light on inside the station. As I stepped out of the car, the door creaked open, and an older man appeared. His face was pale, his eyes sunken, but he smiled faintly as he waved me over. "Evening," he said. "Lost, are we?" "Yeah," I replied, trying to keep my tone light. "I think I took a wrong turn. Just need some gas and directions." He nodded slowly, his gaze lingering on my car. "We don't get many visitors. You'll want to fill up and be on your way before dark." His words sent a shiver down my spine. "Why?" I asked. He hesitated before saying, "The roads around here can get tricky at night." I didn't push for more information. Something about his tone made me think I wouldn't like the answer. I handed him my card, but he shook his head. "Cash only." Thankfully, I had just enough to pay for a full tank. As the pump chugged to life, I glanced toward the town. A single street stretched into the distance, lined with darkened shops and homes. At the far end, a tall clock tower loomed, its hands frozen at 11:55. "What's with the clock?" I asked, nodding toward it. The man stiffened, his expression darkening. "It stopped a long time ago," he said. "Best not to think about it." I was about to ask more when the sound of footsteps caught my attention. A group of people was gathering at the edge of the street, their silhouettes faint in the fading light. They stood motionless, watching me. "Who are they?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. The man didn't answer. He finished pumping the gas, handed me my change, and said, "You should go." "Now." I didn't argue. I climbed back into my car, the engine roaring to life as I pulled onto the main street. The figures didn't move as I passed, their eyes following me with unsettling intensity. As I drove through the town, the sense of unease deepened. The buildings seemed closer together, their shadows stretching across the road. The air felt colder, heavier, and the headlights barely cut through the thickening fog. I reached the end of the street and found myself at the base of the clock tower. The road should have continued past it, but instead it looped back into town. Confused, I turned around, only to find myself driving past the gas station again. The older man was gone, but the figures remained. There were more of them now, lining the street, their faces pale and expressionless. Panic set in as I pressed the gas pedal, speeding toward the edge of town. But no matter which direction I turned, I always ended up back at the clock tower. It was like the town wouldn't let me leave. I stopped the car, my hands shaking as I gripped the wheel. The figures were closing in, their footsteps soft but deliberate. I rolled down the window and shouted, "What do you want?" One of them stepped forward, a woman with hollow eyes and a tattered dress. Her voice was barely audible as she said, "You don't belong here." I tried to respond, but the words caught in my throat. The clock tower loomed above me, its frozen hands casting long shadows across the street. The woman tilted her head, her expression almost pitying. "You need to fix it," she said, "before it's too late." "Fix what?" I asked, but she was already backing away, her form dissolving into the fog. The other figures followed, their shapes fading until I was alone. The air grew colder as I approached the clock tower. The door at its base creaked open, revealing a narrow staircase spiraling into darkness. I didn't want to go inside, but something pulled me forward, an invisible force I couldn't resist. The stairs groaned under my weight as I climbed, each step echoing in the silence. At the top, I found the clock's inner workings, a maze of gears and levers, all motionless. A thick layer of dust coated everything, and the air smelled of rust and decay. In the center of the room stood a single figure. It was the old man from the gas station. He turned slowly, his eyes hollow and his skin stretched too tightly over his bones. He said, "You shouldn't have come here." I didn't mean to, I stammered. "I just want to leave." He shook his head. "There's only one way out." Before I could react, the floor beneath me began to tremble. The gears creaked to life, their rusted teeth grinding together as the clock's hands began to move. The sound was deafening, a mechanical roar that shook the entire tower. The old man smiled, his teeth sharp and yellow. "Time always demands payment," he said. The room blurred, the walls spinning around me as the clock struck midnight. I felt myself falling, the air rushing past me as darkness swallowed everything. When I woke up, I was in my car, parked at the side of a familiar highway. The gas tank was full, the clock on the dashboard reading 7 a.m. I looked around, half expecting to see the figures from Elmswood, but the road was empty. I never found the town again. The GPS doesn't show it, and no one I've spoken to has ever heard of it. But sometimes, late at night, I hear the sound of gears grinding, faint and distant. And I know the clock is still ticking. It was supposed to be a shortcut, a quick detour off the main highway to shave an hour off my drive. I had no reason to doubt it. After all, my friend Alex had used the route before and swore it was faster. But as the sun dipped below the horizon and the narrow, winding road stretched endlessly ahead, I started to regret my decision. The first sign of trouble came when my GPS glitched. The map froze, the little arrow spinning aimlessly. Then it blinked out altogether, leaving me staring at a blank screen. "Great," I muttered, tossing my phone onto the passenger seat. The road grew narrower, the trees on either side crowding closer. Their twisted branches formed a canopy overhead, blocking out what little light remained. I hadn't seen another car in over an hour, and the oppressive silence began to weigh on me. Finally, I spotted a break in the trees. A sign that read, "Welcome to Briarwood Est." 1886 relief washed over me. A town meant gas, directions, and maybe even a place to stretch my legs. But as I drove into Briarwood, I realized something was off. The streets were empty, not just quiet, but completely deserted. The houses lining the main road were dark, their windows empty and lifeless. The storefronts looked frozen in time, their signs faded and cracked. A barber pole outside one shop turned slowly, its red and white stripes dulled with age. I pulled over near the town square, where a weathered statue of a man on horseback stood surrounded by overgrown hedges. There was no sound, no voices, no cars, not even the chirp of crickets. The stillness was unnerving. I got out of the car, my footsteps echoing on the cobblestone street. "Hello," I called out, my voice carrying in the empty square. "Is anyone here?" No response. I walked toward a small diner with a neon sign flickering faintly in the window. The door creaked as I pushed it open, the bell above it jingling softly. Inside, the air was stale, thick with the scent of grease and dust. The booths were empty, the tables covered in a thin layer of grime. A coffee cup sat on the counter, its contents long since evaporated. The jukebox in the corner hummed faintly, though no music played. It felt like the town had been abandoned mid-step, like everyone had simply vanished. As I turned to leave, I noticed a calendar on the wall behind the counter. The date was circled in red October 15th, 1954. I frowned. That couldn't be right. Back outside, the air felt heavier, colder. The shadows of the buildings seemed to stretch and twist, their edges blurring as the sky darkened. I decided to keep moving, hoping to find someone who could help me. I wandered toward the church at the far end of town, its steeple towering above the rooftops. The doors were unlocked, swinging open with a soft groan. Inside, the air was even colder, the faint scent of mildew and candle wax lingering. The pews were empty, the altar covered in a layer of dust. But as I turned to leave, something caught my eye. A figure standing in the back of the church. It was a woman, dressed in a tattered black dress, her face obscured by a veil. She didn't move, didn't speak, just stood there silently. "Excuse me," I said, my voice shaky. "Do you live here?" She tilted her head slightly, her veil shifting enough to reveal pale, sunken cheeks. Then, without a sound, she turned and walked toward the side door, disappearing into the shadows. I should have left right then. I should have gotten in my car and driven as far as I could. But something kept me rooted to the spot, an invisible pull I couldn't resist. I followed her. The side door led to a narrow staircase descending into darkness. I hesitated at the top, the air damp and heavy, before pulling out my phone and using its flashlight to guide me. The stairs creaked under my weight, each step echoing in the silence. At the bottom, I found myself in a stone chamber lit by flickering candles. The walls were lined with strange symbols etched into the rock, their meanings lost to time. In the center of the room stood a large, circular stone table. The woman was gone. I stepped closer, my heart pounding, and noticed something on the table. An old photograph. It was faded, the edges curled, but the image was clear enough. A group of people stood in front of the church, their expressions solemn. I recognized one of them immediately. It was me. I stumbled back, my breath catching in my throat. My mind raced, searching for an explanation, but none came. The photo slipped from my fingers, landing face down on the table. Then I heard it, a low whisper, faint and unintelligible. It grew louder, overlapping voices filling the chamber. I spun around, the flashlight beam darting across the walls, but I was alone. The whispers turned into laughter. Sharp, mocking. The candles flickered, the shadows on the walls twisting into shapes that seemed to move on their own. I ran. I didn't stop until I was back outside, the cold night air hitting me like a slap. The town square was different now. The statue in the center was crumbling, the buildings decayed and broken. The air buzzed with an electric hum, the shadows deeper, more alive. I sprinted to my car, throwing myself inside and slamming the door. The engine roared to life on the first try, and I floored the gas, speeding down the road. The trees blurred past, the road twisting and turning in ways it hadn't before. No matter how far I drove, the town's faint glow remained in my rearview mirror, as if it were following me. When I finally emerged from the forest, the road straightened, and the lights of the highway came into view. Relief washed over me, but it was short-lived. The GPS reset as I pulled onto the main road. The screen blinked, showing my location. Briarwood. I haven't stopped driving since. There was something.